Pack your things, Dad. You got until Sunday. That's what my daughter said to me. Not asked. Told. And my son-in-law was standing right behind her with his arms crossed, nodding like he'd already won something. I didn't say a word. I just looked at them both for a long moment, then turned around and walked back to my room. That was a Thursday evening in March. By Sunday afternoon, I was gone, and I took every single thing that was mine, including the $940,000 I'd been quietly depositing into their joint account over the past 4 years to help them build their future. 2 weeks later, my daughter was calling me 11 times a day. Let me back up. My name is Roy. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a commercial construction firm in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not flashy. I drive a used Buick. I wear the same 3 pairs of khakis on rotation. My late wife, Carol Ann, used to joke that I dressed like a man who'd given up on impressing anyone, and she meant it affectionately. We were married for 38 years before she passed from pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2019. That loss rearranged everything inside me. I won't pretend otherwise. After she died, the house felt like a museum. Every room had something of hers in it. A cardigan on the hook by the back door, her reading glasses still on the nightstand, her handwriting on the grocery list stuck to the fridge. I couldn't bring myself to take any of it down, but I also couldn't stand being there. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the morning with my coffee and just stare at the chair she used to sit in. My daughter Renee called me one evening about 6 months after the funeral. She and her husband, a man named Douglas, had a house in Westerville, about 20 minutes north of me. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a good-sized yard. They had one child at the time, my grandson, Oliver, who was 4 years old, and the best thing in my world after losing Carol Ann. Renee said, "Dad, we've been talking, and we want you to move in with us. We have the space. Oliver misses you, and we don't want you alone in that house." I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I called my friend Barton, a retired electrician I'd known since my 30s, and asked what he thought. Barton said, "Roy, multi-generational living can work, but you need to go in with clear expectations. Talk about money, space, everything up front." Good advice. Barton always had good advice. I went back to Renee and said yes, but I laid out some terms. I would contribute to the household. I wasn't interested in being a guest or a burden. I'd pay into the mortgage, cover utilities, and handle a portion of groceries. We settled on $2,100 a month, which was roughly what I'd been paying in property taxes and upkeep on my own house anyway. I sold my house in Bexley that fall, got $387,000 for it in that market, and I moved into their basement bedroom in November 2019. The first year was genuinely good. Oliver was 5 and relentless in the way that only small children can be. He'd wake me up at 6:30 on Saturday mornings by standing next to my bed and just staring at me until I opened my eyes. We'd go to the kitchen and make pancakes together and watch cartoons while Renee and Douglas slept in. Those mornings felt like oxygen. Douglas and I weren't close, but we were cordial. He worked in insurance sales. He was the kind of man who dominated dinner conversation with opinions about things he'd only read a summary of. But he was decent to my daughter and he was good with Oliver. So I kept my thoughts to myself. We watched football on Sundays. It was fine. The trouble started in early 2021. Not dramatically. It crept in. Renee mentioned, almost casually, that they were thinking about refinancing. Interest rates were still low, and they wanted to pull some equity out to renovate the kitchen. She mentioned the monthly payments would go up. I said I could increase my contribution to $2,800. Then Douglas lost his job in April. His company did a round of layoffs and he was in the middle of it. He found new work by June, but at a lower salary. Meanwhile, Renee had cut back her hours at the dental office where she worked as an office manager, because Oliver was now in school and someone needed to handle pickups and activities. Money was tight. I understood that. I quietly increased my contribution to $3,500 a month. I never made a production of it. I just started depositing more. Here's something I should tell you. During those years, I had not been idle financially. Before Carol Ann passed, we'd made some careful investments, a mix of index funds, a couple of rental properties we'd bought in the late 90s, and a small business interest I'd sold in 2018. After the house sale and some other settlements, my total net worth sat at just over $1.8 million. I was not wealthy by any dramatic standard, but I was deeply comfortable. I lived simply. I had a financial advisor named Phil, who I spoke to every quarter, and Phil always told me I was in better shape than I gave myself credit for. I never talked about this with Rennie and Douglas, not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't relevant to our arrangement. I was paying my share. That was what mattered. The shift happened on a Sunday in September 2022. I'd left my laptop open on the kitchen counter. I was in the backyard with Oliver, kicking a soccer ball around. When I came inside for water, Douglas was standing near the counter. He moved away when he saw me, but something in his posture was off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. That evening, Douglas was different, quieter, watching me. And over the following weeks, I noticed the dynamic in the house beginning to change in ways I struggled to name at first. Renee started dropping comments about the basement, how it would make a great playroom for Oliver, how Oliver's friend from school had a whole game room in the basement, how the basement was underutilized. I'd been living down there for 3 years. My books were there. My recliner for 3 years. My books were there. My recliner. Carol Ann's photo albums, which I looked at more than I'd admit to anyone. Then the dinner conversations changed. Douglas started bringing up money more openly. He mentioned that they had looked into a home equity line and the bank needed them to demonstrate consistent monthly income. He said something about how outside contributions didn't always count the right way for lenders. I wasn't sure what he was getting at, but I noticed he and Renee exchanged a look across the table. A few weeks later, Renee sat down with me after Oliver was in bed. She said they were thinking about converting the basement into a proper income-generating rental unit, an Airbnb, actually, and that it might be better for everyone if I looked into getting my own place. She said it gently. She said they loved having me, and it wasn't personal. She said they'd help me find an apartment. I asked her what brought this on. She said the house expenses were high, and the rental income would help. I said, the $3,500 a month I give you doesn't help. She got very quiet. Then she said, Dad, we just think it might be better for everyone to have their own space. I told her I needed to think about it. I went downstairs that night and sat in my recliner in the dark for a long time. I thought about Carol Ann. I thought about what Barton had said to me 3 years earlier about going in with clear expectations. I thought about the fact that I'd sold my house, the house Carol Ann and I had lived in for 22 years, and that money was gone now, spent on settling into a life here. I called Phil, my financial advisor, the next morning. Not to talk about money, just to talk. Phil was a practical man, and he had a way of organizing my thoughts when they got tangled. He listened to the whole story and then he said, Roy, what do you want? I sat with that question for a long time. What I wanted was to be treated like a person, not a line item. The following Sunday evening, Renee came to me again. This time, Douglas was with her. He did most of the talking. He said they'd found a nice senior apartment complex in Gahana. He'd even pulled up the website on his phone to show me. He said the monthly rent was $1,400, which he pointed out was well within what I was paying them now. He smiled when he said it, like he was doing me a favor. I looked at the website. Then I looked at him. Then I looked at my daughter, who was studying the floor. I said, I'll let you know. That was Thursday. He had given me until Sunday. I spent Friday and Saturday making phone calls. I called a real estate agent I'd worked with during the house sale, a woman named Peggy who was sharp and no nonsense. I told her what I was looking for and what my budget was. She called me back Saturday afternoon with three options. I chose one over the phone. A two-bedroom ranch house in a quiet neighborhood in Dublin, Ohio. Brand new listing. I put down an earnest money deposit by electronic transfer that evening. I also called Phil. I told him to put a hold on the monthly transfers I'd been making to cover contributions to Renee and Douglas's household accounts. And then I called my attorney, a man named Hal I'd used for estate planning since the mid-90s. I told him I wanted to update my will. Specifically, I wanted to establish a trust for Oliver directly in his name to be managed by Hal's firm, accessible to Oliver at age 25 for education, housing, or career purposes, not accessible to his parents. I also told Hal I wanted to formalize a personal loan I'd apparently been making over the past several years, because if I'd been paying $3,500 a month for 38 months, that was $133,000 I'd given to a household that was now asking me to leave. Hal said he could put together a demand letter if I wanted. I told him to hold off on that. For now. Sunday came. I packed what was mine. My clothes, my books, Carol Ann's photo albums, the small ceramic lamp she'd painted herself that sat on my nightstand. I packed my laptop, my files, my recliner disassembled into the back of a rented pickup truck. Douglas watched from the kitchen window. He didn't come out to help. Renee stood on the porch. She looked like she might cry. I hugged her and I said, "I love you, sweetheart." Because I did. That hadn't changed. Then I drove away. I closed on the Dublin house 23 days later. It was smaller than what Carol Ann and I had, but it had a good kitchen and a little backyard with a dogwood tree that was just starting to bud. I bought a new couch. I hung Carol Ann's photos. I set up the ceramic lamp on my nightstand. I called Barton and he came over and we sat on the back porch and talked for 3 hours. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Settled. Meanwhile, I started to understand what had actually happened in that house. Till put it together for me. When Douglas had been standing near my open laptop that Sunday in September 2022, he'd seen my investment account summary, which I'd been reviewing. He'd seen the number, and from that point forward, the decision had apparently been made that they needed to restructure things. Getting me out of the basement meant they could rent it on Airbnb for $150 to $200 a night. It also meant they could potentially approach me for something more direct once I was on my own, and they assumed lonely and pliable. That assumption was the mistake. About 3 weeks after I moved out, Renee called. I answered because she was my daughter, and I always would. She asked how I was settling in. We talked for a few minutes. Then she said, "Dad, I've been thinking. Douglas and I have been talking about maybe doing a renovation on the upstairs bathroom and possibly adding a sunroom. We found a contractor. It's going to be about $47,000. A pause. We were wondering if you might want to help with that as kind of an investment in the property." I said, "Renee, I'm not in the property." She said, "Right, but it's still family." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Let me think about it." I called Hal. I asked him to send the demand letter. It laid out the informal loan arrangement, $133,000 over 38 months, and requested repayment within 90 days, noting that the money had been transferred in good faith as household contribution under a verbal agreement that the living arrangement would be ongoing. Douglas called me an hour after they received it. He was not calm. He said I was being vindictive. He said I was punishing Renee. He said I was punishing Renee. He said I was going to regret this. He said a lot of things. I let him finish. Then I said, "Douglas, I think you should speak to an attorney." And I hung up. Renee called that night. She was crying. She said she didn't know about the letter, that Hal had sent it directly to Douglas. She said this wasn't what she wanted, that she missed me, that Douglas had pushed for the whole thing, and she'd gone along with it, and now she didn't know what to do. I listened to all of it. I said, "I know, sweetheart. because I did believe her mostly. Renee wasn't cruel. She was weak, which is its own kind of problem. But it's a different one. I said, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to pretend the past year didn't happen. And I'm not going to give you $47,000 for a Sungoon. But here's what I am going to do. I'm going to keep showing up for Oliver every week because none of this is his fault and he is never going to feel it from my end. She was quiet. Then she said, what about the letter? I said, that's between you and your attorney. Ultimately, we negotiated. Hal worked it out. They didn't have $133,000 liquid, so we restructured it as a formal promissory note, $133,000 at 3% interest, payable over 7 years in monthly installments. Every payment comes in on time. I put every dollar of it directly into Oliver's trust. Douglas and I don't speak. That's fine. Some relationships run their course. Renee and I have dinner together once a month. She drives to Dublin and I cook. We talk about Oliver, about her work, about whatever's in the news. We don't talk about the letter or the basement or the laptop left open on the counter. I think we both know that the version of our relationship we have now is smaller than what it was before, but it's honest in a way it wasn't then. Oliver is 9 now. He comes to stay with me on alternate weekends. We make pancakes. We watch whatever he's currently obsessed with. It changes constantly. He told me last month that my house was his favorite place to think. I don't know where a 9-year-old picks up a phrase like that, but I wrote it down when he left so I wouldn't forget it. Last fall, I got a dog. A 5-year-old beagle mix from the Franklin County shelter named Pete. He sleeps at the foot of my bed and follows me from room to room and has absolutely no opinions about money or property values. I turn 68 in July. I have my house, my dog, my grandson, every other weekend, and my friend Barton, who still comes over to sit on the porch and say things that make me think. I have Carol Ann's lamp on my nightstand and her photos on the wall and the dogwood tree in the backyard that goes pink every April. Some people have asked me if I regret how I handled it. If the letter was too much, if I should have let it go. I think about that sometimes, honestly. There are nights I wonder if I made it harder than it needed to be. But when I think about standing in that kitchen on a Thursday evening with my son-in-law's arms crossed and my daughter looking at the floor, and I remember how it felt to be the man who'd sold his home, carried his wife's photo albums into someone else's basement, and paid to be there, and still been handed a deadline. No, I don't regret it. I just wish it hadn't been necessary. There's a dogwood tree in my backyard that blooms every April, whether I'm watching or not. I think about that sometimes, how things grow on their own schedule, indifferent to whether anyone is paying attention. People are a little like that too. You find out who they really are, not when things are easy, but when they think no one is keeping score. I wasn't keeping score, not in the beginning. I moved into that basement with Carol Ann's photo albums and my recliner and genuinely believed we were all going to be fine. I was paying my share. I was pleasant. I was trying. And for a while, that was enough. The trouble with arrangements built on goodwill is that goodwill on its own doesn't hold when the numbers get interesting. What Douglas saw on that laptop changed everything. Not because the number was large, it wasn't obscene, but because it revealed that I was someone worth calculating. That's the thing about a certain kind of person. They don't see a father or a grandfather or a man who lost his wife and was just trying to stay connected to his family. They see an asset. And the moment they do, everything that looked like warmth starts to look like positioning. I've spent some time since then thinking about what I actually did right and what I did wrong in all of this. Honesty requires me to hold both. I was too quiet for too long. I let the terms of our arrangement drift without saying anything, and that silence was its own kind of mistake. There's a version of integrity that isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about saying the true thing, even when it's uncomfortable. I waited too long to say the true thing. But I also think about what I did when it mattered. I didn't act in anger. I didn't make a scene on that Sunday when I packed my car. I called Phil, I called Hal, I called Peggy, and I made decisions that I could live with 3 years down the road. That's not detachment. That's the kind of thinking that only comes when you've been through enough hard things to know that the first emotion is rarely the right guide. You feel the hurt, you let it be there. And then you think anyway. The promissory note wasn't about the money. Not really. Phil knows that. Botan knows that. The money now goes into Oliver's trust every month like clockwork, because Oliver is 9 years old and not responsible for a single thing that happened in that house. The note was about saying clearly, in language that couldn't be misread, what was done to me was not acceptable, and I am not the kind of man who disappears quietly when it costs him nothing to disappear. That, I think, is what gets missed in stories like mine. People want to talk about the revenge part, the letter, the stopped payments, the husband who called and yelled and then had to hang up and call an attorney. And yes, there was satisfaction in that. I won't pretend otherwise. But the part that actually changed something in me was smaller and quieter. It was driving to Dublin with Carol Ann's lamp, wrapped in a dish towel on the passenger seat, pulling into a driveway that was mine, and understanding that I had not let what happened make me smaller. Some people get pushed out of places and they get bitter. They shrink. They spend years cataloging what was taken. I didn't want that. I wanted the dogwood tree and Pete asleep at the foot of the bed, and Oliver making pancakes on a Saturday morning and asking questions I don't always have answers to. I wanted a life that was actually mine, not a version of someone else's life I was paying to participate in. You only get that if you're willing to stand up and walk out the door when they tell you to and mean it.